And today I want to take a little bit deeper. I hope we can also turn this classroom into a sanctuary where we can all find some kind of rest, at least spiritually also. And let me begin with a story. This story is told by Anthony de Mello, one of the great Catholic spiritual writers. He tells of a time that changed his life, that questioned his ideas of happiness. He was in the slums of Calcutta, and he met a rickshaw puller, and the name of the guy was Ramchandra. And very sad story because Ramchandra had sold his skeleton away ahead of time to a pharmaceutical company, right? The buyer had first asked Ramchandra, the rickshaw rider, how long had he been riding the rickshaw in Calcutta, with all the pollution and all of that. And he said, I've been doing this for 10 years. Well, it turns out that they have a lifespan, living in that carbon monoxide type situation. So you can, just like you have home equity loans and all of that, you can actually sell your skeletons to the pharmaceutical company ahead of time, right? So they advance you money ahead of time, right? So when you die, your bones belong to them, right? So on hearing that, Anthony de Mello, the Catholic priest, asked him, I'm so sorry about that because, he was coughing already, close to having tuberculosis and all of that. And he said, I'm sorry that you have to go through all of this to feed your family and all of that. And Ramchandra said, you know what, I'm not sad. I am not sad because other than my health, I've got a good family. I do not know how long I'm going to live. I've got a great wife. I've got great kids. And he said, I do the things I can do and I leave the rest to God. Right? Ramchandra was, in the eyes of Anthony de Mello, living every moment to the fullest. He was alive. And he said, I was dead. As a Catholic priest, this was a man who was alive and I was dead, right? And he said, I was in the presence of a mystic. I thought I was a mystic, but I was in the presence of a mystic, and a lot of things just didn't make sense to him after that, right? So he recalibrated his life after that and wrote a lot of books as a result. So he was asking this question then, what causes unhappiness? Well, typical answers, your loneliness, your depression, and all of that. So Anthony de Mello came to the conclusion that there's really only one cause of unhappiness: the false beliefs that you have in your head. Of course, it's overstated, but you see the point, right? The false beliefs that you have in your head, beliefs so widespread, so commonly held, that it never occurs to you to question them. Our mental programming is so strong, and the pressure of society so intense that we get trapped in programmed ways of thinking that we are almost programmed to be unhappy when certain things happen to us, and then when other things happen to us, we are happy. We have been programmed that way, that we don't even question the programming that we have, right? And another example was when I was growing up, and half of my life was in Malaysia, in Penang. I had an aunt, my father's sister. Later on, I found out she wasn't really his sister. My dad's family turned out was from Malaysia, went to Indonesia, and bought her as a family slave. Never knew they had such things back then, but it helped everyone. It helped the family. So she came over to Malaysia, right, to take care of my dad's family. See, I only found out those things much later, but I remember we would always be riding the rickshaw. Bad things would always be happening to her. She would cook and cater for as a business and all that to support the entire family when everybody grew old and all of that. So I remember with all the misfortunes and all of that, I was sitting in a rickshaw, in that little three-wheel bicycle, riding around on the streets and all that. I was asking her, why are you so happy? Because in my mind, there are almost no reasons for you to be happy. And she looked at me. almost in the most innocent way, and she asked me, what's there not to be? And it was almost as if it was a puzzling question to her. Why, in her Chinese way, she said, why shouldn't I be happy? I have you, I have my friends, I cook once in a while, we watch a Charles Bronson movie, right? Right, and all of that. What is there to be unhappy about? And that really stuck. That really stuck. Because we have certain ideas about happiness, for example. One of them, we believe that we can be happier if we rearrange the world around us to attain and maintain our programmed desires, right? So for example, our programming, whether we've inherited it from the culture, our experience, our families, programs us to believe that we cannot be happy without certain persons and certain things. Money, power, success, approval, a good reputation, or love. Without any of these things, I cannot be happy if I don't have them. See, that's a program, right? Or the desire to acquire this precious something or this precious person, right? So what happens before we get it? We are so thrilled when we attain it. And even when we get it, we get anxious because we might lose it. And then when we lose it, we become miserable. So the cycle of the programming goes, right? So it is an exhausting task that leaves us little energy for the business of living and enjoying life fully. Or the other one, happiness will come if you manage to change the situation you are in and the people around you. Not true. So we squander so much energy trying to rearrange the world. If changing the world is your vocation in life, we can try to make it happen, but do not harbor the illusion that it will make you happy. What makes you happy or unhappy is not the world and the people around you, but the thinking and the programming that we have inherited. So be aware, again, this is coming from Catholic spirituality, right? Be aware of our inner programming. As Jesus said, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. Do not be conformed to the patterns of the world, but we don't ask what those patterns are, right? It could be our inherited program that we never question. We question everything around us except the lenses through which we live, right? Well, why is the power of programming so important? Some may be saying, you know what, this sounds like the Zen Buddhist kind of stuff. No, it's not, okay? Let me give you some real life examples, right? Go to Japan, right? Some students kill themselves because they fail an exam. Mm-hmm. Would you kill yourself if you fail this class? No, not worth it. So what killed them? The exam? Pressure. No. You can call it pressure, but the pressure takes the form of an interpretive assumption, a narrative, right? So what kills them is not the exam, but the programming in the head. Okay? But of course they don't question the programming, they question only the failed exam. See how it works? Or in the past, in tribal societies, what do they do to the person who has committed some kind of crime or something like that? Banishment. They kick you out of the tribe. Interestingly enough, some die. Now, if you were kicked out of your families, would you die? Unlikely not, because you're operating with a different program. That's the point, right? We never question the programs that we walk with and live with. So, what is the new internal grace program God wants us to put on then? Well, as Paul says, I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I've always found great comfort in the fact that Paul had to learn contentment. It never came easy for him. He needed practice, right? I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do everything through Him who gives me strength. So for him, happiness and contentment was never an external situation. It was always internal. He instead rearranged his program, right? And let me end with, so I put in your notes, peace is when the awareness of the presence of God is greater than the awareness of the presence of our difficulties and problems. It does not mean that we do not have difficulties. Some of us in this class today, maybe you've been going through a really rough season, right? But I like the next verse, 2 Corinthians 6:10. Again, one of my favorites. Our hearts ache, but we always have joy. You see the two sides? You can have an aching heart while also having joy. We are poor, but we give spiritual riches to others, and we own nothing, and yet we have everything. So let me close with this quote by Henry Nouwen, and many of you know this spiritual writer. The question of where to live and what to do is really insignificant compared to the question of how to keep the eyes of my heart focused on God. I can be teaching at Yale, working in a bakery at the Genesee Abbey, or walking around with poor children in Peru and feel totally useless, miserable, and depressed in all these situations. There is no such thing as the right place, the right job, the right calling, or ministry. I can be happy or unhappy in all situations. I am sure of it because I have been. I have felt distraught and joyful in situations of abundance as well as poverty, in situations of popularity and anonymity, in situations of success and failure. The difference was never based on the situation itself, but always on my state of mind and heart. When I knew I was walking with God, I always felt happy and at peace. When I was entangled in my own complaints and emotional needs, I always felt restless and divided. It is a simple truth that comes to me now, in a time when I have decided about my future. Deciding to do this, that, or the other for the next 5, 10, or 20 years is no great decision. Turning fully, unconditionally, and without fear to God is. Yet this awareness sets me free. Let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you that we can be in a place where we can declare your presence here with us and receive that presence into our lives. Thank you that we have a safe space, a place we can turn into a sanctuary to allow you to minister to us, each of us in our different needs. You know what those needs are. And we receive your healing, your restoration, your comfort, your presence, your grace, your forgiveness, and we receive your joy that gives us strength. Even as we learn together right now, would you give us wisdom? Be our teacher. We give you thanks in your name. Amen. Let's begin with suicide. I want to begin with this today just to give you another example of how to work through an issue that has multiple contexts. Because remember the trick question, what do you feel or what do you think about suicide? By now, what should your response be?
What do you mean about suicide?
Exactly. What context are you talking about? Right? See, I'm glad you responded that way. All right. So it is complex because how do we understand the phenomenon of suicide? To what extent is it our genetic predisposition? Right? I mean, in a room like that, we have those who have very low emotional baselines. You know what I mean, right? It takes very little to ruffle us emotionally and we fall into biochemical depression very easily. On the other hand, we have those, there's a name for those people who are on the other end. We call those people those who have won the cortical lottery. Okay? Cortical lottery is when you're left, what do you call it? See, I'm forgetting my neuroscience. The cortex on the left side has more firings. So I've met a person like this, it's my own mom, right? Not everyone has that. We say they've won the lottery because they are more detached from situations and they are always, no matter what happens, they're doing fine, right? So a person like my mother would, because in a church like ours, we deal with depression. Sometimes we have it ourselves and all of that. Her comment is always, "Why do people get depressed? What are they depressed about?" I look at her and I always say to her, "Mom, you have no idea how blessed you are to even have to ask a question like that," right? Because many of us know what that feels like. So that's the other end of it. So what even is what makes a person want to commit suicide? Is it a person with a higher baseline emotionally or less biochemical triggers? Or is it a person with more biochemical triggers towards depression, right? We have to ask that question. Or another one, is it always wrong to commit suicide, right? Is it a sin? It's a theological question now. So it's a very broad issue. So let's now talk about the different contexts. And again, you probably have an answer to this already, but I'm working this through the perspective of being aware of the different context, right? Okay, so let's begin with the first context. The person who is contemplating or the person who is planning to commit suicide. Is it biochemical? Or is it a person who has diminished capacities, right? I've had one case, for example, with a person on the borderline of depression, but putting this person through the institutionalized system in San Diego made the person worse. Because what do you do if people want to commit suicide? You call the police. What do? They bring them to the hospital, put them on suicide watch, right? And then what do they do with them? They put them in the psychiatric ward and watch them, right? So if you've seen and been in situations like this or visited folks who have been in situations like this, I was wondering, if I was borderline wanting to commit suicide, if you put me through that system, I would probably commit suicide. So we also have to ask the question, what kind of environment is the person in? Is a person in a clinical situation that actually encourages a person to cross the line, for example? Because you have to ask, where is this person, right? Where is this person? Okay, so the first one is the person wanting to commit suicide. Second one, very importantly, the people or persons who are dealing with a suicidal person. They are often the ones forgotten, right? They are living in constant powerlessness and guilt. And for those of you who've dealt with those who want to commit suicide, you know what that feels like. Should you intervene in this situation? And you intervene too much, you get sucked into that web where you cannot extricate yourself anymore, and the person sucks the energy out of you, and even you want to commit suicide, right? So the people who are helping those family members or friends or spouses, boyfriends, girlfriends, they need to be well taken care of, because most of the time, if they are not trained, they don't even know where the lines are. They feel that if they don't help, if the person commits suicide, it is my fault. So that is that person, right? Usually they deal with powerlessness and guilt. I know I can do something, but if I don't do, it's even worse, because the end is too final. Third one, how do you deal with those whose loved ones have committed suicide? That is the one I find most common, actually, in a class like this or in ethical situations. Okay? So then the next question becomes, how then do we deal with the phenomenon of suicide, ecclesiologically or from the perspective of the church or theologically? But I want to throw in a third category, historically. Okay? And in a moment you'll understand why I throw in that word historically. Now, what does the church think about suicide? Before we move on, what do you all think? What are your first instincts? Okay, this is not the trick question anymore. What are your initial thoughts about suicide? Or what the church should do? Anyone? Fred?
I was always thought that it was you're taking away something came into something that God gave you.
Right.
So, like,
So you would classify it as a sin? Okay?
yeah, yeah.
Right. Thou shalt not kill. It so happens you're killing yourself this time. Right? Anyone else? What do y'all think? Yeah.
I feel like a person going through it, say, I think they just need love, you know, and the church should really embrace, you know, a person, you know, in their situation, regardless of the context. I feel like just showering them with love is pretty much the ultimate thing, kind of, to either sway them away of the idea and kind of heal whatever demons they're facing.
Right.
And, so yeah, but yeah, I do think it's the sin to kill yourself.
Right.
Because you're killing yourself, you're murder, yeah.
Is a person serious about suicide, or is the person using that for attention? You know,
Yeah.
it's different for each situation too.
Certain situation, yeah.
Right. Okay. Yes, Derek.
I do think it's a bit hard to talk about objectively for people who don't have not experienced it. Same thing with homosexuality.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Right. So you would say for those who have been very close to it, they would feel differently and
Yeah.
interpret it differently.
And for people who don't, maybe
Right.
bring an opinion.
Exactly. Yeah. That's a very important point to make. Yes, Katie.
Some subjective experience to this, and not to like hijack discussion. And
No, please, please.
Sure. I attempted suicide when I was 18 and told in college. Obviously survived by the grace of God. So this is, I wasn't a Christian and I didn't have church, but that's been a very, looking at how the church has dealt with it from somebody who has that history,
Mhm.
has been in some situations very poor. And in other situations, incredibly loving and so full of grace. But it honestly, it depends on the person and it depends
Right.
on the church. And there's so many different attitudes.
Yeah.
If you don't mind me asking, what was it about the church that you thought was not helpful?
I think treating it like, and for me, my experience, so I've had major depression pretty much my entire adult life.
Mhm.
And treating that like it was a lack of faith,
Right.
instead of treating it as, this is mental illness.
Mhm.
You know, this is a sickness, this is something that you can do a lot to help yourself and you can do a lot to try and control, but it's ultimately, you know, it's beyond you in a lot of ways. And then instead of treating it like, you know, you wouldn't deal with this if you just believed more, if you just believed in God more. And there's sort of this like, almost like a health and wealth kind of gospel treatment of it. Like, well, you're depressed because you don't have enough faith, your faith isn't strong enough, your walk with God isn't strong enough, you know, you need to be doing X, Y, Z, and kind of putting it back on you, and you know, putting it back on me in my faith and my relationship with God, which was really not helpful and not really, not a bad teacher.
Mhm. Well, thank you for the boldness for sharing that with us. Thank you.
I'm passionate about this topic.
Thank you. That would be an example of giving simplistic answers to complex problems. You make it worse, right? When we do that, we take a complex issue, oversimplify it, and moralize it. Okay? So do be aware of that, and especially if you've been in an ethics class, you don't want to do that. You want to find out more, okay? Yes, Derek.
I almost want to say the flip side of, I know people who like are afraid to talk about it, maybe because from a lack of experience too. So I know that's some way people, like the fact that you present this as a viable thing, I think shows how much that needs to be done. I think for Christians, we should be open to talk about any and everything, but I know it's sort of numb for a lot of Christians, and I think that sort of does injustice for kids, you know, people, you know, they're more prone to depression whenever their chemical clock is changing. So seeing that their parents are engaged in this conversation with spiritual leaders, I think is very important too.
Right. One thing that might help at our church and in my groups, we always dedicate a place that we call theological safe space. Meaning this is a place where you have the freedom and the safety to talk about anything without being judged, right? If that's the place we can create wherever we are, it allows people to become more honest. And safety comes before sharing, right? So, yeah, somebody else wanted to share something over here? Anyone?
Yeah,
Yes,
so just
Chow.
piping a little bit. I had a similar experience. I had also depressed for about a dozen years, adult life. So I think probably the most important thing for the church is relationship building, and that's hard because we're not that great at relationship building. So not, a lot of people in church aren't that great at it. So for someone to have depression and to want to open up to someone, you have to have a good relationship first, right?
Right.
Safe space, stuff like that, non-judgmental stuff, attitude. So I think that's the church can get better at it, but that takes a lot of work. It's not just like get better at it and
Right,
get better.
exactly.
The church needs time to grow too.
Right. That is true. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, earlier on I mentioned the history. Now, why history? Okay, let me begin. A little bit of history. In classical Greece, and I'll move forward very quickly. In classical Greece, suicide was tolerated and often applauded when it was done by generals, right, and philosophers. In other words, if your status was high and you committed suicide, it was not a bad thing. But if you were a slave and you committed suicide, it was a bad thing, because your labor was necessary to uphold society, right? Very utilitarian society, right, in Greece. Then we move on to the Romans, who predate Jesus. Suicide was either neutral or favorable. That's interesting, right? So, what happens is, then Jesus comes, the church is born, the church is persecuted. Many Christians, because of persecution, do one of two things. One of them is martyrdom. They die for their faith. Now, that really requires a lot of courage to die for your faith. But there's also another group of people that we don't generally talk about. Some don't want to die for their faith in public. What do? They commit suicide. Right? I'm in control of my own death, right? So the church was not quite sure what to do with it because it was a new phenomenon. So something started to change in the 4th century with St. Augustine. With St. Augustine, he would classify, and that has shaped the church since then. He classified suicide as a crime. It was one of the greatest sins. Why? Because the 6th commandment says, thou shalt not kill, and worst reason, there is no possibility of repentance after the fact. Right? So that's St. Augustine. He considered it a crime. Then we move to the 13th century with another theological giant, Thomas Aquinas. And he called it not a venial sin, but a mortal sin. If you know a little bit about Catholic practices, a mortal sin is the worst possible sins you can make, versus the venial ones, which are the lesser ones. You can just go to confession, get things cleaned out and all of that, right? He considered suicide a crime against 3 parties: a crime against God, against justice, and against the state. Right? So that's Thomas Aquinas. Because by then, church and state, they're very close together. So we have now to legalize morality, right? Because church and state was together by the 13th century. So what else? Interestingly enough, when you look at the Bible textually, you can only find suicide by implication, but not very directly in terms of what the Bible says, whether it is right or wrong. The Bible is a little bit ambiguous about it, but what happened was by the year 700 in the Catholic Church, anyone who attempted suicide would now be excommunicated. So now you have an ecclesiological change, meaning a church change, and a change in behavior. And here's something interesting. That is the year 700, you get excommunicated for trying to even commit suicide. And by the way, that's not unusual. From where I come from in Singapore, when you are in the military, you cannot attempt to commit suicide. If you try to commit suicide and you don't die, you get sent to prison. So we tell all our colleagues over there who are soldiers, if you're going to commit suicide, please be successful. It's really odd. It's really bizarre and morbid, right? So where we come from is not too different from the Middle Ages. But here's something that happened in the Middle Ages. because suicide was seen as something so awful in the eyes of God that they would actually practice humiliation on the corpses. Okay? And I'll give you references, those books over there on the history of suicide. So, number one, they would not perform burial services. The body would not be put in the churchyard or the church cemetery. Sometimes the dead body or the corpse might be dragged through the streets for animals to eat. Sometimes hung at the public gallows. Or what else? The one I found interesting was they would leave some of them on the crossroads, right, where there's constant traffic on top of it, because they believe that the spirit would be restless with all the traffic above. So there was a lot of superstition even in the church in regards to suicide. So that was the Middle Ages, right? So the point I wanted to make was, depending on your geohistory, meaning where you are born, when you are born, the kind of denomination you come out of, sort of helps interpret the phenomenon of suicide, right? And, Katie, you were talking about some churches were helpful, some were, it depends where you are. And that's quite scary if you think about it, right? And a lot of ethical issues are like that, right? If you were trying to be a woman, trying to be ordained 50 years ago, it will be a different battle, right? So geohistory really matters. Let me give you one example of where things started to change. You can almost see a big change even in America. My sense was it happened about 2013. Of course, way before that in the psychology, MFT programs and all of that, way earlier. But in the public realm, when Matthew Warren, the son of Rick Warren, passed away, it became very public, right? His son committed suicide. This is what he wrote. I don't know if it's in your notes. No, I gave it a mother's one, not the father. This is what Rick Warren wrote. He says, in a public letter, over the past 33 years, we've been together through every kind of crisis. Kay and I have been privileged to hold your hands as you face a crisis or loss, stand with you at graveyards, gravesides, and prayed for you when ill. Today we need your prayer for us, right? No words can express the anguish, grief we feel right now. Do you have it in your notes?
Yes.
Okay, good. Our youngest son, Matthew, age 27, and with a lifelong member of Saddleback, died today. You who watched Matthew grow up knew he was an incredibly kind, gentle, and compassionate man. He had a brilliant intellect and a gift for sensing who was most in pain and most uncomfortable in a room. He'd then make a beeline to that person to encourage or engage and encourage them. But only those closest knew that he struggled from birth with mental illness, dark holes of depression, and even suicidal thoughts. In spite of America's best doctors, meds, counselors, and prayers for healing, the torture of mental illness never subsided. Today, after a fun evening together with Kay and me, in a momentary wave of despair at his home, he took his life. Kay and I often marvel at his courage to keep moving in spite of relentless pain. I'll never forget how many years ago, after another approach had failed to give relief, Matthew said, "Dad, I know I'm going to heaven. Why can't I just die and end this pain?" But he kept going for another decade. Thank you for your love and prayers. Now, here is Kay Warren, the mother, talking about the families wrestling with this before he even committed suicide. I thought it's a very telling one because that church has done a phenomenal job of dealing with emotional griefs and heartaches. They have a Celebrate Recovery ministry that we adopted even in our own church. But this is what she said at a conference to Anglicans. This is what she said. In the last 2.5 years, our 4th grandchild nearly died at birth during an emergency C-section. 7 weeks later, our daughter was diagnosed with brain tumor and had to undergo 26 hours of brain surgery with a long recovery. Our daughter had severe autoimmune disease, and my mother slid mentally into dementia, which made me the primary caregiver. On top of this, our youngest child, Matthew, struggles with bipolar disease and has found it difficult to keep going. We have hung on by a thread of a fingernail, right? And then later on, I have great family and friends. I'm not embarrassed to be in need. There is no big girl pill, nor can I simply chill out. When I realize, because of God's extravagant, lavish love for me, and that I am His beloved, I can survive the painful circumstances that come into our lives. We need to tell people that they are the beloved of God. In doing so, we remove the shame. It removes the guilt over sins I can't conquer. We are called to be messy with people and be with people in tremendous need. When you know you are His beloved and not God's bother, you risk it all for Him. People may persecute you and hate you, but you know also how much God loves you. Okay, let's now turn to the biblical and theological. Okay, so this is a little bit of history. Where you are born, when you are born, really affects how one deals with this problem. Many turn to Judas as the example of a bad example of why we should not commit suicide. And true, I think all of us agree none of us ought to, right? But that's not usually the issue. It's because a person cannot stand it anymore, which is why they want to choose to commit suicide. But let's try to read Judas with a little bit more sensitivity, okay? I'll begin with him, and then I'll continue with the others, and we'll come back to him again, just to lay out some other possibilities when we read Judas. This is only a starting point, but we'll get to him more later. When you look at Judas Iscariot's predicament for betraying Jesus, in Matthew 27:3 it says that he was seized with remorse. King James says he even repented, by the way. He did, right? What happened to him? In his grief, later he committed suicide, but we are informed that he did not go back to his community. Instead, he fled with a guilty conscience to the place where he wanted some kind of validation, right? Only to find himself being betrayed by the same people who betrayed Jesus, right? So, we'll come back to him in a moment, okay? I would say that let's look at him a bit differently from the eyes of grace. But let's look at more hopeful images of people who tried to commit suicide in the Bible. The first one is Elijah. Elijah wanted to commit suicide. He couldn't take it anymore. But what does the Bible tell us? How do you deal with a suicidal person? The biblical account shows that God, in that moment, brings comfort and compassion to him and feeds him and brings him rest to a suicidal person. Okay? 1 Kings 19, 1-13. God gave him food and drink and an opportunity to rest. It is a way to minister to a grieving person, right? Or a depressed person. Now, when we look at Jonah, the other example, he was in grief too. He wanted to take his own life. The sailors did not want him to take his life. That's an example of compassionate people around him. But at the same time, it also shows another side of suicide, right? A suicidal person sometimes cannot be persuaded to do otherwise. And that happens. That is why we have suicides, right? So that is the case of Jonah. Okay. So as we said earlier on, what does the Bible really say about it? The Bible seems to see suicide more as a tragedy, it seems, according to many scholars. A tragedy more than anything else. There is no direct command on either side. It is implied that yes, you should not, but there is no direct condemnation. Yeah, you can use the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill, but it's a little bit of a doing hermeneutical gymnastics to say, okay, the person who kills himself, because the command to not kill, that is premeditated murder on someone else in its intent, if we do interpretation. To kill yourself is a different sort of a situation, right? Okay, then let's ask the question then. How do you deal with someone who has encountered someone close who has committed suicide? And this unfortunately happens a lot. We had an ethics class not long ago, and there was a pastor at the back who was clearly not very comfortable at this point. And he was saying, I just did a funeral service for my own sister who committed suicide. And his question was, it was very direct. You think she's going to heaven? And I'm thinking, okay, let's now rehearse all the theological resources. How do you deal with this one? Is there a way to deal with someone? Because this happens a lot. Sometimes we are the ones dealing with it in our own lives. So this was what I said. The responses that I'm giving are only one of many possible ones. I'm just giving you samples. The goal is to try to remain as biblical as possible while trying to be embracing as possible. So I just did the opposite of not just responding, I started to ask questions. The first question was, my guess is part of the anxiety you have is because you do not know. That is what is causing you even greater grief right now, right? So I asked the next question. You know your sister better than anyone else. Tell me, where do you think your sister ought to be? And that's the question I always ask. Where do you think your sister ought to be? And then he said, look, my sister was not the most perfect person, but she tried her darndest best to try to understand God. She tried her best to trust God. But it didn't seem good enough. She was not that strong. She just kept breaking, and she just couldn't take it anymore. Right? Okay. Then came the next question. See, you know her so well, and you love her tremendously. Correct? Where do you think, where would you like your sister to be? She said, well, of course I would like her to be in the arms of Jesus. Of course. All right? Okay. Next question. Why? Because if you knew her the way I knew her, and that's where she should be, right? Next question. When you say, after knowing the insides and outsides of who your sister is, you think she should be in the presence of Jesus, where did you get that sense of fairness from? Because obviously you are using a standard, some standard on the basis of which, yeah, she tried her best, but she just couldn't cut it because she was too exhausted, right? Where did you get your sense of love and fairness from? Well, he never thought about it, right? I said, how about I try to answer that one? You got it from God. We are made in the image of God, and our sense of right and wrong, even in its most imperfect ways, come from God. How do I know that? Look at Matthew chapter 7, verse 11. If then you who are evil know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? This is what I wanted to convey to him. You know, you, knowing your sister so well, would love to see her in the presence of God. You want to know something? Your love for her cannot be compared to God's love. If God compares our love to our loved ones as that which who are evil. If even those who are evil, right, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more your Father in heaven? In other words, if you in your imperfect love would love to see your own sister in the presence of God, how much more will your Father who loves your sister better than you want to see your sister in his own arms? I would put your sister in a more loving set of arms than in your arms. Does it make sense? Because we know who God is. Whatever we think, God is far more loving. And I want to put that person in the arms of God, who loves your loved ones or loved one a lot more than you. I would trust her in the arms of a loving God. Okay? So, do I know the final answers? I do not know. But here's what we do in ethics. Always begin with what you know, not speculation. We know the love of God, so we can focus on that one. But put it in a way that makes sense to someone who is grieving. Okay? So, Let's see. Let's briefly talk about Judas, the problem case in the Bible. Remember the first step. Jesus chose Judas. Judas did not choose Jesus. Okay? Jesus knew Judas even before he picked him and knowing that he would betray him. Okay? Okay, that's for starters. And by the way, most don't realize Judas did repent. Right? In your notes, Matthew 27 verse 4, I have sinned, he said. Right? But in verse 3 particularly, then Judas, who had betrayed Jesus, when he saw that he was condemned, repented himself and brought again the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, to the wrong people. Right? Some say he should have brought it to his community. Now, the third point, Jesus always called him friend. Okay? Heteros, meaning a comrade, a partner. Right? There's a tradition in the early church that Judas's suicide was based on hope because he knew where he was going. That was one of the interpretations of the early church. Okay? Now, if you look at the fuller account of Judas, right, we know that Jesus already knew of his betrayal and he would love him and would die for him anyway. Okay? How do we know that? Because what happens after the betrayal and all of that? Jesus chooses to wash Judas's feet. Not 10 disciples' feet, not 11 disciples' feet, but 12 disciples' feet. So when he came to Judas, he would wash even the feet of the betrayer. He washed the denier's feet, he washed the betrayer's feet. Right? And what does Jesus say? Immediately after doing all of that, I have given you an example to follow. What example? The example of love. So, if you rewind the tape a bit, Jesus knew he was going to betray him, and Jesus would continue washing his feet. And then he tells the people around, do the same. Right? And this is the example of love. And then some of you may ask the question, oh, but Jesus was betrayed by him. But yes, actually Jesus was betrayed specifically by 3 persons. Judas, Peter, and left alone by the Father. Okay? That's not considered a betrayal, but he was left by the Father also. And Peter also. So, again, this is speculation. So at this point we are at speculation level, okay? I believe there was grace given to Judas. But what is not speculation is this. Jesus saw the darkness ahead of time, that we would betray him, Judas would betray him, and he would still die in spite of the evil that he knew. Okay? So, any comments, any questions at all about Judas? I thought I'd just throw that in a little bit. Any comments?
Thank you.
Yes,
You said that Jesus was betrayed by Judas, Peter, and who?
the Father. The Father is not technically a betrayal. It is, Father, in more specific language, my God, why have you forsaken? Sometimes I'm wondering if betrayal is worse than forsakenness, or forsakenness is worse by someone you love. Ooh, if I'm betrayed by an enemy of mine, okay, he's an enemy. If I'm forsaken by someone I love, ooh, that cuts deep. So emotionally, I'm not sure which is worse, right? Yeah. Yes.
I mean, it's good that we're having this discussion because, as I told you before, coming into the class, I'm being deconstructed. So, these topics are so important to look at in a way of ultimate compassion and not give that simplistic answer that whether or not we know is true or not true can cause more harm than good. I'm just glad that we selected this topic for us to discuss.
I'm glad for that. Some have asked, how do I know if the action that I'm taking is the right one? St. Augustine had his response, love God with all your heart and then do as you will. This is what I tell my congregations in a slightly different way. You know if you are doing something right in a complicated situation when your action will lead to something that is life-giving, love-giving, and hope-giving. You take that away, whatever response you may be following the Bible, but Jesus was always life-giving, hope-giving, and love-giving in any situation. Even when he dealt with sin, right? Whether it's a rich young ruler, he was very direct. Jesus wasn't light on sin, but that was always the result. Okay? Any comments? Yes,
I
Derek.
have a question. It seems like, just noting how people talk about the subject and the other one, it goes from something that's not understood, and then almost the next question directly is usually about salvation. It usually goes from that to sort of an unknown and trying to broadcast and to predict some salvation.
Right.
And so, which is usually because they're afraid, which I think here a lot of times refers to love, so because they care of that person. But I guess with that, you have to, it seems salvation is almost an ethical, also a fact of moral topic itself, which maybe we could study like the concrete way of salvation. Because a lot of this kind of gets to hints of universalism, which I would love to discuss, but
Right.
I feel like that's.
And we will come to that when we talk about Pope Francis and a few episodes away, okay? But you are right, because very often if we come from an evangelical template setup, everything is always revolving around saved or not saved, lost your salvation, or once saved, always saved. So that template never goes away, right? So in a way, it's good that someone brings it up because it gives you an opportunity to explain what is going on. Okay, because you know why? Then if you were to push back, what is salvation? Whoa. Now you're going to get depending on where the person comes from, so many responses. So go straight to the text of Scripture. Okay, what is salvation in its most etymological Greek simple understanding? Okay. What is the meaning of salvation? If you're evangelical, it means, okay, give your life to Christ. When you die, you go to heaven. Okay, that's an implication, but not the heart of salvation. What is the heart of salvation? Soterio means wholeness. That is what soterio, salvation, means. Meaning spiritual, physical, moral, and then what else? Then you have to go to systematic theology for that, right? In other words, when Jesus substituted himself on the cross to bring salvation, it is to bring wholeness. The problem with a narrower view of salvation is conversion. See, we confuse conversion with salvation. Salvation is the big package. When you give your life to Christ and all of that language, that is conversion. So, here's how it looks like. I may be converted, I go to church, when I die, something wonderful is going to happen to me. But guess what? My emotional life is broken. If that is true, I am not whole. I may be spiritually converted, I may be whole in that area, but emotionally I am not. Or I may have horrible relationships. So in my relationships, I am not whole. So if you want to bring in salvation to this, it's a wonderful place, because then you can say this person may have a sort of a relationship with God, but emotionally this person needs to experience the salvific wholeness of God in that area of their relationship or in their emotional life. Okay? So salvation includes bringing a person who is wrestling with depression and all that into wholeness. So you are right in a way, because that is part of the larger salvation package. Thank God for that. We need to preach that, the bigger message instead of the smaller version of it. And in fact, that is good news, right? Yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to hijack, but in a sense then, or I guess how would you, I know language is tough, Greek and English, but then past tense of save. where it turns out that wholeness has been imparted at one time. And since we are saved,
Only if you reduce salvation to conversion.
right?
That's a problem. That is to misunderstand salvation. A big thing like salvation, it's that big, we squeeze it into that thing called conversion. So now when we ask a person, are you saved? Wrong question. It should be, are you converted? It's a different question. We confuse a big word with a smaller reality. Does it make sense? Okay.